Greetings, everyone. So thank you for joining us for IFEEDER's webinar today, along with the Context Network. My name is Laura Moody, and I'm the Executive Director for the Institute for Feed Education and Research. Today, we're going to be going over some of the new resources that IFEEDER has just made available to the American Feed Industry Association members and others. Context is going to help walk us through that. Before we get started today, just a quick logistics note. So if you happen to have any technical issues during the webinar, one, you can post a message in the chat, and Daisy Rodriguez on AFIA's meeting team will assist with that. Two, it's going to be recorded, so we'll make the webinar available. If you do happen to have any issues, you'll always be able to access the recording. And then the third item is if you have questions throughout the webinar, we're going to take them at the end, but go ahead and type them into the chat so that we can be prepared to answer those. So with that, we'll get started. Emily, if you'll go to the next slide. So just a quick introduction. IFEEDER is the Institute for Feed Education and Research. We are the Research and Education Foundation that broadly supports the U.S. animal feed and pet food industry. Our mission is to advance understanding and trust in a sustainable feed and pet food supply chain through timely research and education. If you'll go one more slide, Emily. In 2021, IFEEDER initiated work with the Context team on the sustainability roadmap, as well as with resources to support the animal feed and pet food industry on their sustainability journeys. And we've been working with Context as our partner on this for the last few years. And in that effort, they have engaged not only the industry, but many stakeholders in the space to help us understand what feed can do and provide resources that the industry can utilize. And so those new resources that we're going to be talking about today, specifically focused on life cycle assessments, they were created with input from all of the industry members that you see on the screen here, not only their input and time, but also their resources to help support the project. So if you'll go one more slide, the resources that we're going to talk about today are included now within the Animal Food Industry Sustainability Toolkit. You can find that toolkit on ifeeder.org. Specifically to life cycle assessment, as we engaged the industry, we realized there were a variety of resources that industry members needed to have. And so those 5 resources that we have added include a broad overview of the LCA process. So if you're just getting started, what are we even talking about with an LCA and what might you need to consider? A glossary of terms, life cycle assessments. We'll try not to use too many acronyms today, but life cycle assessments have terminology of their own. And so there's a glossary of terms for that. We included industry member insights. So what's currently going on in the LCA space in the animal feed and pet food industry. We'll dive into a little bit of that today. A decision tree that you can use with your own teams internally to decide what you should be doing or how you should be approaching life cycle assessments in your organization. And then I think something that's really helpful, or you're going to really find helpful, is the landscape mapping and profiles. So if you need to decide what model to use or what method to use or who you can have as a practitioner to help you, there's insights into that as well. And so those are the types of things that are in the resources, and we'll walk through those today. One more slide, Emily. And so overall, IFEEDER's objective with this piece of our roadmap work was to get an understanding of the current state of life cycle assessments or analyses within the feed industry, to consider where LCI or life cycle inventories are for the industry, and you'll hear a little bit about that today relative to completing LCAs, and then what those implications were for the American Feed Industry Association members and IFEEDER itself. And so with that, I'm going to go off camera now and turn it over to the very informed folks at Context, starting with Sarah Frank, who's the project manager for Context. And please, as a reminder, put some notes and put some questions into the chat, and we'll get to those as we get to the end of the conference. So turning it over to you now, Sarah. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura, and good to meet everyone here. We appreciate you joining the call and excited to share some of the work that we've done within this project to support IFEEDER and all of your companies as well, too. Just as a little bit of a background, if you're not familiar with context, we are a consulting firm that is focused on agriculture and work across the agriculture supply chains and practices that support that value chain, such as sustainability. You might see if you look us up that we are now a Kearney company. We were recently acquired by Kearney and will be supporting their food and ag practice as well in the future. Throughout the call, you'll also hear from Emily Pfaffenbach-Frank. She's a senior business analyst with our group, helps support a lot of the analysis for this work, and Matt Sundvermillen, who's a partner with Context as well, too. So with that, we just want to go through a little bit of background and kind of what was this project, what was the process that we used, and it was a 3-phase project. First, doing some discovery with understanding a little bit about GFLI, which is the Global Feed Life Cycle Institute, I believe. Sorry, I got that mixed up. And then we also interviewed quite a few AFIA and IFEEDER members regarding kind of their involvement in LCAs, how we can support their needs through this work, and getting some preliminary insights. And that'll be the first thing we walk through with you. And then also a landscape assessment. So like Laura said earlier, understanding who are the major players in an LCA and how do you think about an LCA and who to involve when you start those discussions. The second phase here, if we go to the next one, was development. So we put together this guide for the North American feed industry, and we'll walk through everything that's included in that guide. Of course, today we'll only be walking through a certain subsection of that, but as Laura said, online there's lots more resources to access, so I encourage you to do that. And then we've also put it together some different insights for GFLI as well as IFEEDER, which was in phase 3, where we execute and deploy this material too. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Emily to walk through some of the insights that we heard from the interviews. Hopefully this will be very insightful for you, just so you can understand what kind of insights we heard that really started this project and helped inform it.
Thanks, Sarah, and nice to meet everyone on the webinar today. So one of the first things we did throughout this project was conducted a series of interviews with different members from IFEEDER, AFIA, as well as ANAC, the Canadian Organization for Feed. And we interviewed 15 different organizations to gain their perspectives on the broad LCA environment, trying to understand the LCA environment as a whole, the current and future LCA engagement that they plan to be involved in, as well as how IFEEDER can support the members' needs in the future. So you'll see the logos up here. These are the individuals that we've interviewed, and this will be representative of the next few slides where the data is coming from. So one of the first questions we asked was, where is an organization on their LCA journey? And as you can see from this graph, that 9 out of the 15 interviewees identified that they have started or completed an LCA to date. And you can see the breakdown there. It was a neat opportunity to see, where an organization might place themselves on this sort of scale. And it helps inform where their perspective is coming from for the rest of the questions. The drivers to completing an LCA. So this was a big question that we asked and spent a lot of time on. And there's 3 main buckets of drivers, and these drivers are coming from interviewees who elected that they had and had not completed an LCA. So from both sides of the spectrum, trying to figure out what's the driver to completing one. So the 3 main buckets, the first one, strategy, second one, customers, and then regulatory pressure. Under strategy, some of the key insights that we found and heard were the overall company strategy support. So they're really looking to have that support from the data in an LCA to be able to move forward with their sustainability targets, goals, etc. Number 2, understanding how much potential value is in a specific product. So if you do an LCA on a specific product, you'll be able to understand from the data a little bit more about where that potential value is. Number 3, identify what areas we are doing well in and where we can improve. And then number 4, benchmarking information to improve upon year over year. Under the second bucket there, some of the main key insights that we heard were the ability to have a robust conversation with customers, The customers are coming to them and they really want to know the answers to some of these questions. And so having this data is a helpful tool in that. Number two, quantifying the potential impact of a specific product for customers. So that goes back to that strategy piece of understanding the potential value. And number three, customers who are looking to meet their climate goals, they're asking for proof. And so the data is a good way to provide that. Under regulatory pressure, reporting obligations, regulatory pressures, for example, the EU Green Deal, society and industry pressures for sustainable accounting, which could entail corporate sustainability reporting directive or the feed product environmental footprint category rules, and then net zero emission targets and other public commitments that organizations have made. The next piece that we asked about was
just a quick. I apologize.
Oh, yeah.
I apologize for interrupting and being slow on my toggle here. A couple of the conversations, as you saw from the previous slide, that related to where people are on their journey and the number of LCAs and then how they are applying them. A number of them, as you can imagine, had just one particular aspect of this related to where they've come from and why. Others had very distinct strategic linkages that related to how they are internally looking at efficiencies, looking at progress, the implications to their relationships with their employees and to their customers and to their customers' customers. And so there was a wide spectrum, as you can imagine, in how these aspects came into play, depending on where the organization sat in their journey. Thanks. That's all.
Thanks, Matt. So the next question that we asked them was for interviewees to identify the boundaries of their LCA that was completed. So these are only responses from those who had elected that they had completed an LCA or have gotten far enough in the process to assign a boundary to it. So there were three main boundary groups. The first one is cradle to farm gate. So that's going from the grower all the way through the feed milling and manufacturing. The second one is cradle to processor gate, which goes from grower all the way through live animal production. And the third one is cradle to grave, which goes from grower all the way to the consumer. So the full value chain.
Lara and IFEEDER hosted a panel at the Sustainable Ag Summit that had to deal with LCA harmonization. And when we think about harmonization, it can be as simple as harmonizing how we are looking at the different stages of the production system that we are doing our analysis on through our LCA, and the importance of it in the ability to compare and contrast results, to think of the strategic implications. And this is just one of those small pieces of the puzzle where it can make a big difference. Next, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. The last main piece here that we asked during the interviews was for indicator mentions. We asked interviewees who had completed an LCA to know, what indicators they covered in that process and why it was important to them. And so you'll see that the first three listed here on that top row are the most mentions. So GHG emissions, which included carbon footprint, land use change, and water consumption. Those were the three main categories that most individuals who had completed an LCA were really focused in on and were the most important to gain data analysis for. I won't read all the rest of them here, but as you can see, there is quite a distribution of people with the 12 mentions up at GHG emissions all the way down to people just focusing in on one specific key indicator down there at the bottom.
Land use change coming into play in that top middle, the middle of the top row, has significant implications on everything around it on both shoulders, from a GHG emission standpoint, as well as a water consumption and water quality aspect that comes into play. And so it's interesting how the ambiguity associated with land use change and the ability to have clear, concise definitions, the application of those definitions into calculations, and the importance and how that can weight how a company reports on their GHG, on their water, on other aspects of it. This is an interesting factor that's becoming very challenging for people, for organizations, as they try and make progress towards their targets and goals.
Sarah, I believe I'm turning it over to you now.
Yep, that's all right. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Matt. All right, so the first thing we want to start doing is going through some of the resources that those interviews helped inform. So what we did was looked at some of those insights that we heard from the interviews. What are some of the knowledge gaps? What areas are people interested in? And put together associated great tools. So the first one is just an overview of the LCA. This one we won't go through as much for time, but wanted to present what this includes. So we went over what's the purpose of an LCA. So the definition, which is the systematic analysis of the environmental impacts associated with all stages of a product's life. So in case you weren't familiar with what an LCA meant, it's a great definition to use. And so we've included a lot of information about what's a good use for an LCA, what's a poor use for an LCA, such as looking at you don't want to look at one pork producer versus another, for example, or different systems and proteins with pork versus meat versus chicken. So just some examples of maybe how not to use an LCA as well. The next piece, Emily, if you will, was the process for that LCA. And we're going to get into this a little bit more in just a minute. So I'm going to skip over this one. And then the last piece is an ISO review. This is something that you might hear if we go to the next one, please. Sorry about that. An ISO panel review process. This is something you might hear associated with an LCA. And an ISO is really to provide some standards and guidelines and requirements for conducting an LCA. There's a specific ISO number, of which we've sourced here, that really establishes those principles and frameworks that are specific for LCA. And there is a review process associated with that. We've outlined this process here with a panel, preparing a panel, selecting different panel members, and having a review process just to make sure that LCA really fits the criteria and the standards of an ISO. And so that will be an ISO conformance for an LCA. We could probably talk about that for another hour. So now we'll just leave that kind of a high level, but do encourage you to reach out to those resources. One of the areas we did want to spend quite a bit of time talking through is a decision tree. Laura talked about this earlier, but having some different questions and decisions that you need to make if you're thinking about an LCA or evaluating, is this a good path for my organization to go down? And so we wanted to provide some key questions and decisions that you can use internally, you can use yourself to really understand what you need to do to proceed with an LCA if you'd like to do so. So I'm going to go through these quite quickly here for time, but do encourage you to put any questions in the chat for us to look at later as well, too, if there's something that sticks out to you or you'd like to learn about more. So let's first go into how this decision tree is set up. So again, there's different areas and buckets of questions that our team thought about, and we heard in these interviews that we thought would be great to structure this decision tree. So the first thing is value. So what are the demand opportunities and the return on investment that you could look at from a portfolio standpoint, from branded products, and what's going to provide the team with the greatest return? So thinking about value first when we think about an LCA. Then the commitment. So if we do want to do an LCA, how much of the team's time, how many resources is an LCA going to take? And is this something you could do to hire some outside help for? And then going into some prioritizations. What are the goals of the LCA? What is the scope of it? What are the different considerations you need to have when you do the LCA? And then finally executing, and what are those associated steps? So next, we're going to go into a little bit more detail on each of these different buckets. So again, starting with value, those demand opportunities. So the first question we thought that's really helpful to answer is what are you trying to accomplish with your LCA? And then associated with that is what question is your LCA answering? What are you trying to get out of it? And then kind of coming off of that, who is asking for an LCA or its data? Why is it important to them? So if someone's asking for LCA, is it internal stakeholders? Is it related to your company commitments, your marketing or product differentiation? Or is it an external source? So is it government and compliance related, or is it your customers? And understanding kind of what's the driver behind that ask as well. From there, if we go to the next slide, continuing with value, there's some questions to consider for what are you going to use the LCA and its data for? So what do you need to do to make the business case? Are you using the LCA for company internal reporting, for public reporting, for continuous improvement, for talking with your customers, for doing some competitive benchmarking? or for decision-making factors? Is this going to influence your positioning or the development of products in the future? And so that's going to be really important to understand the use of that LCA so you can make sure as you develop it, it relates back to that use and you have a tight scope on and boundary on that LCA. We'll go to the next slide, please. So then there's a couple questions that we'd like to pose to think about for commitment. So understanding what's the focus needed for developing an LCA. So you've kind of gone through those value questions. Maybe you've thought a little bit about that, talked internally, and maybe you've decided, okay, yes, we'd like to see if we want to pursue an LCA. And so thinking about those commitment questions related to pursuing one. So we want you to think about, how does this fit with your company culture? So where does it fit in your company? Is it going to be companies that think their products eco-friendly and need to prove it through an LCA, or is it going to be that you've made a public commitment and you've signed up with an initiative like SBTI or Net Zero? And so understanding that first. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then thinking about the team, who's going to work on this LCA, who's responsible. So do you have an internal team that's going to have some time committed to this effort? And then who's going to need to be on that team? Is it going to be the people internally, and do those people have the resources needed to complete it? Do you need to hire additional people? Do you need to hire a practitioner? And then related to that, how do you go about hiring a practitioner? So a couple of questions to really consider just to think about how you're going to get this done. What's the resources needed? What's the time commitment of this? And so we've got a couple areas for you to think about related to that. Go to the next question. So then thinking about that third bucket, which is going to be prioritization. So understanding what are the strategic considerations here. So to start that, the first question is, what are those 2 to 3 questions that you want the LCA to answer? As we've worked with clients in the past, we've really found that any more than 3 questions, that's a lot for an LCA to answer. 2 to 3 at the most is going to be really important to make sure you've got ample data and ample defensibility of those 2 to 3 questions. And then from those questions, you want to understand the goal. So are you comparing to other products? Are you looking at product categories, industry averages that you're comparing to? So really exploring those and understanding what the variation between those might be. For example, what geographies are relevant to those that you want to include. And so that's really going to set the stage for that, again, that scope and the boundaries of your LCA and what you prioritize for it to focus on. Next slide, please. Again, for prioritization, the next part of that scoping conversation is going to be the goal and scope more specific to it. So exact scope. So you've got your questions, you've thought about some different things related to those questions. And now we're going to get really specific into the scope and also the boundaries. And when we think about boundaries, oftentimes that's going to be within the value chain. So when we think about the animal value chain, are you going from the inputs all the way to harvest and further processing, or are you cutting the boundary to be very specific and not all inclusive? So those are some things you can consider. And then for those boundaries and that scope, what type of data is needed? So are you looking at what you have available? So do you have some primary data? Do you have secondary data? And then looking at the quantity and quality of that data. That's going to be really important because there might be some areas where you see, oh, we've got lots of data here, and some areas where maybe you don't have as much data and you need to find some different sources for that or look at some other databases. And so that's definitely an area that we'd emphasize as well to really consider. Next slide, please. And I believe lastly for prioritization here, again, we've looked at the scope we need to cover, but also the indicators and metrics. Are you looking at GHG only? Are you looking at a full EU PEF? So there's many different indicators under that. And then again, do you have the quantity and quality of data to cover those areas? And then what data do you need to meet those expectations? Make sure you have high confidence, high certainty. You can comply with different regulations as well within that data set. I believe the next will be our last slide here. And finally, execution. So you've got everything clearly defined. Now you're ready to go create the LCA. So what's the process for that? So you need to understand what type of model do you want to use. There's many different platforms like SEMA Pro, OpenLCA. There's some background data sources and impact characterization modeling. We've got a lot more information about that I encourage you to look at in the toolkit. We won't go into the specifics of those today. And then the second piece of what type of methodology do you want to use? Attributional, consequential. We've got some definitions for those as well, but there's some different areas you want to look at using a methodology for and how it's appropriate to what you're trying to do. And then lastly, different types of standards. So IPCC, FAO, ISO, lots of different acronyms here. And we've got, again, some profiles on each of those for you to learn more about. I believe this wraps up the decision tree. Matt, anything else you want to add? I think you've added some additional information too in the chat.
No, I just dropped in a few thoughts in the chat, as you mentioned, Sarah. And these should not be considered tablets being brought down from the mount. These are guidances, and this is informed by our experiences in supporting people through these processes, as well as the tremendous insights that y'all shared with us during the process itself. That's all.
Thanks, Matt. All right, I understand we went through that pretty quickly, but again, encourage you to take a look at that and also feel free to put any questions in the chat. I'll turn it over to Emily to talk about also the landscape mapping that we completed.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, so the next key tool that we've developed here is what we're calling a landscape mapping. This section includes the LC landscape map overall, and I'll show you that here in a second. Here's a little clip, but then also an overview and key insights for the different sections within the landscape. So standards, regulations, data sets, LCI, LCA software, LCA practitioners, and examples for each of those, as well as what do we mean by them, what's the impact of them, what do they do. So we'll go through a couple of these examples here in a moment, but this really just helps you understand the entities involved and related to LCAs, what their purpose is, and then some key insights to consider when going through this process. So the first piece here is the overall landscape that I mentioned. It just kind of gives you a high-level view of the landscape and what the players are and where they sit within relevant to each other in this landscape. And for each of these, we've developed kind of a list of, just a representative list of the type of organizations that sit within each of these sections within the landscape. This is not all-inclusive. There could be other ones that are not mentioned here. There's no rhyme or reason that we didn't include them. These are just the most common ones, or the ones that we're most familiar with that we covered here for you guys. Matt, more to add?
And again, the expectation of this is not to be exacting with surgical precision. The intention of this is to bring generalities and to give strategic guidance around it. One example of that is when you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Laura said we are going to try and focus on not using acronyms. It's incredibly difficult, to be honest, for me to do this. But IPCC, as that acronym of that, also brings in data sets that are available to you that you can then interpret and to include in your LCA or to use to drive your LCA. So it can show up in other areas as well, just so that you recognize there's a lot of flux in this model, but it's intended to give you strategic direction into how these systems come together.
Thanks, Matt. And a little bit of what Matt was just talking about is covered in what we're calling these mini profiles. So there is a page that covers each one of these that's listed there on the left-hand side. It just gives you a quick overview and a link to their webpage to learn more if you're interested, just to give you a quick covering of who they are and what do they do. Sarah, I'm turning it back to you.
All right. So to wrap all of this up into kind of what this means for iFeeder, for the feed industry, we really see the current state as the downstream scope 3 commitments really sending some demand signals for LCAs for the animal feed industry. And so in response to that, iFeeder has put together all the tools that we've gone over. Again, there's much more that you can feel free to take a look at. And that really helps the reach to really our end vision. And there's a lot more to do to get here, but having the US feed industry account for its footprint to compete in domestic and global markets. So again, that's really how we see the vision for this with Laura in collaboration with her to really advance, again, the feed industry in the sustainability landscape. So on the next slide, just to wrap up, we've gone over a lot of different resources. I'm sure you've got some questions on those. So we'd love to maybe take some time now for some Q&A, and then we've got a short poll to wrap us up at the end. So Laura, if you want to facilitate us through that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe you can just leave that slide up, Emily. I appreciate the insights into the different elements of it. One piece that I would point out, just because a question that I frequently get from the members of AFIA or others is, we know we need to do an LCA. Where do we start? Who do we call? Like, who can help us with this? And I've struggled to answer that in some ways. And so one of the things you touched on a little bit here, but I think one of the great resources in that landscape mapping and profiles piece is that description of practitioners. And so there's a list of practitioners, again, not an inclusive list perhaps, but there's about 20 practitioners that are listed in there and the types of work that they're doing in the space. And so that's a question that I get from a lot of folks is, who can we go to do this with? And who do we even start with? So I think that's a great piece in there. While folks hopefully are thinking of some questions to ask you, because you guys are a great resource in this space, a couple of things that came to my mind. We talked a little bit about LCA, but also the term LCI came up. And it took me a while to sort out LCI and LCA in my mind, especially because I think sometimes an LCA outcome can become an LCI for another component. And so Matt, I wonder if you would just maybe talk a little bit about LCA versus LCI, what those two things mean. There we are talking in acronyms again, but would you talk a little bit about those two?
Yeah, it gets back to if LCA is an engine that transforms data into an outcome that can help inform decisions and to create value or to mitigate risk. If LCA is the engine, LCI is the fuel that goes into the engine and creates that. Now, one of the outputs, as you mentioned, from an LCA, for example, let's say that you do an LCA on your liquid feed coming into fed cattle ration, into feedlot rations. You perform an LCA on that ingredient and the components that come into it to figure out what its footprint is and its impact is on the environment. You then have that can go into an LCI data set, and so that anybody that is feeding cattle can be informed by that LCA from your liquid feed that then comes into their LCA for their impact on cattle that are fed your ingredient. That's an example of how it comes to life. Does that help?
Yeah, so I think for clarity, what you're saying there is, if we think about, we mentioned briefly the Global Feed Life Cycle Assessment Database, so GFLI. And if we're looking at GFLI, if somebody were to take, using your example, molasses, they did an LCA, they had an LCA outcome for molasses, but they submitted that data set to GFLI. Then the cattle industry might choose to do a footprint of a production system in the cattle industry. And then in that case, GFLI becomes the LCI data set for the beef cattle LCA. And so don't get mixed up in the terminologies, but that can be challenging to think about in that space. Another question that came to mind as I was listening here is, I recognize the answer is it depends, but how long does it take to complete an LCA? You know, you have, so the example I would have is we probably end up with an industry member who is working on, you know, bids to their customers, and they get a call from their customer that says, hey, the higher ups in our office are asking us to get carbon footprints or water footprints from our suppliers. And so do you have an LCA for your ingredient? And so our members are generally like, no. And so then the answer is, the question is, how long does it take to get it? Is this something we can get in 6 weeks or 6 months, or what does that look like?
Yeah, you can. Our experience in helping customers get this done is it can be as brief as 6 to 8 weeks if you have a good knowledge base, a good understanding, a good set of, one, the question that you are trying to answer, two, the data sets, including the quality and quantity of the data, that your confidence level of the output coming out of it can be high. It can be a relatively brief period of time. It can be a mess, and it can be over 12 months, especially if the question that is being asked is not well understood, and that what has happened that we have seen and experienced in the past is that customers have said, well, I want to do an LCA, and they perform the LCA, they get the answer out, and they go, what the heck? Why is our number 7 and this number 6 and that number 5? And what is, and you quickly get into a discussion around what was the question we were trying to answer. It goes back to, it can be as simple as going back to boundaries. What were the boundaries that we had discussed earlier around where were those boundaries set, and where can you expect to see a variance in those systems? Or it can be related to, as well as, the quality and quantity of the data that you have available. And so understanding those pieces and doing an analysis of them ahead of time can be tremendous value for you, and reduce the risk associated with the quality of the LCA coming out of it, and the frustration internally that you experience.
Awesome. I've got another question for you, and possibly has to do a little bit with one of the slides that we passed over, but and so maybe we pull this one back up. Another question that comes to mind is when somebody does a life cycle assessment, they could have the team in place to do it internally. Maybe they have somebody hired that's got that background and they can do that. They could go with an external practitioner to get that done. Could be a university member, like there are those folks that offer this services. So no matter how you go about it, who says it's right? Does it have to be verified? Does it have to be reviewed? How do you make decisions on, like, who reviews the process? Who does it?
There is no governing body that takes and analyzes every single LCA that is done and does an assessment of them. That doesn't exist. But what does exist is the different ways that you can have around the understanding of the quality of the LCA. As Sarah mentioned, ISO 14040 and ISO 14046 relate to and are good standards that can help you understand the quality and the impact that your LCA has outside of your organization, and how it should be viewed. The interpretation of those is in the eye of the beholder, but the beauty of that panel review that Sarah mentioned is that it goes into professionals that have an outside view, looking inside the quality of your LCA and holding it to a standard. And that is then managed by the manager of the LCA and their responsibility, again, as a practitioner. So that goes a long ways. There are also assurances that you can have done for professional organizations coming in and looking at and performing an assessment of the LCA and giving an assurance as to its outcomes that can also be done. So kind of like buying diamonds, you know, it depends on where you go and what standards you're living up to and expecting and how you look at it. It's that strategic leadership discussion that you have around what are we going to do with this? What are the decisions that we're going to make as a result of it, and the decisions that others are going to make? What is the confidence level that you want in those decisions? Some decisions don't warrant as deep of a dive as others do. So that's I'm not sure that answers your question, but are there other aspects that come into play?
Yeah, I think just the recognition that it's important to have some external element review and to document the steps that you're taking in the process. Some folks who have heard me talk about life cycle assessments in various presentations will hear me say that, yes, we have this great standard, right? The International Standard Organization has these great standards here listed that we have on this slide. But it's still a bit of a choose your own adventure. So I think about it like the books that we used to have when we were kids, right? So you start the process, here's the first thing you answer, and then you do this or this. And so for that reason, it's not surprising that we end up with LCAs that have, you'll see where LCAs have different outcomes. Like the same two groups of people could do an LCA, or two different groups of people could do an LCA on the same product and end up with different outcomes, depending on how they answered the questions within that decision tree, and then how they chose or selected items in the ISO process. And so just maybe a little foreshadowing into some of the work that we are thinking about pursuing and currently engaging stakeholders in is this recognition that we need, you heard Matt say at one point in time, harmonization. So we did a panel at the Sustainable Ag Summit 2 weeks ago where we talked about this need for harmonization in the agricultural supply chain. And even within feed, we're starting to get some harmonization through GFLI, but still we have a lot of challenges around common data sets that we use and common boundaries that we use and how we account for ingredients once they're actually into the animal system itself, right? So once an animal consumes it, and that has an impact on the footprint. And so how do we account for those things? And so be on the lookout. I think you'll hear us talk more about challenges in that space. So I don't have anything more to add. We don't have any questions coming up in the chat. So I guess I'm gonna, Matt, if your team wants to round this out, we do have a quick survey opportunity. Oh, I got one question actually that just came in from Terry. So is ISO the recommended harmonization standard? And how do we get all practitioners on board with this?
Short answer, yes. In our opinion, ISO is the best grounding that is out there. Getting all practitioners on board with this in the application is, in my opinion, based on setting norms within the industry. And the norms that need to be set from a harmonization standpoint are complex. And so they're not easy solutions, Terry, as you know. One of the issues that came up during the panel discussion in Minneapolis had to do with the interface between feed and biofuels and the challenge associated with the lack of harmonization between the way those calculations are done and the implications of them. So that's a massive piece that has to move forward, and by bringing the parties together, and IFEEDER and AFIA, you, Lara, and your team are best suited for that convergence, in our opinion, to help move that forward in a progressive manner, to recognize first what the dilemmas or the challenges are that and the implications of those challenges, and addressing the highest priority ones first, and getting some quick wins. This gets back into a change management model. It gets back into leading from the front, and making progress over it instead of looking for perfection. Many organizations have tried to manage harmonization on a small scale basis and had limited success in the ability for those those expectations and practices to move forward. So there is a possibility of it being done, and being done significantly better than it has in the past. It's bringing the parties together. It's setting expectations and understanding the implications of the gaps that we have now when we don't have it done well. And those gaps and those implications are massive in the implications of how a feed ingredient it comes into a feed LCA if it is not managed well when that data is run and comes into it from a biofuel standard. That's a huge implication. And so you have this tension that needs to be managed appropriately, and you have different parties, some that are government related, others that are completely independent and private. And so it's that multi-stakeholder mess that we get into at times.
Yeah, and so just I see I will get to the question about having the presentations available in a moment, but I just want to give a real quick example. And so just for clarity, the ISO standard is currently addresses. I mean, currently the biofuels piece can use is using the ISO standard. GFLI is using the ISO standard, so we're using the same standard. There is harmonization of that standard. The challenge is that there's so many options, the choose your own adventure element within the standard, that's where we lack the harmonization. So very correctly, the biofuels industry is using their renewable fuel standards and the directive they have for how they do the allocations of their environmental footprint, and they allocate based on mass. Well, in the feed industry within GFLI, we do allocate, GFLI allocates based on mass, energy, and economics, but our preference would be to allocate based on economics. And so correctly, we end up with the feed industry allocating based on economics and the biofuels industry allocating based on mass, but that leads to completely different outcomes, and it creates challenges when people start trying to do the carbon accounting. And so there's an example where everybody's using the same standard, but it's the choices they're making within the standard that are confusing or complexing or not harmonized. On presentation, so number one, IFEEDER will publish the recording of this webinar as well as the slides in its newsletter next week. I think we'll also send a recording out to everybody who registered for the webinar, and we can put the slides there. But you don't have to wait for that. If you go to ifeeder.org and you access the sustainability toolkit, all of the content that you saw today are pieces of the toolkit. So the toolkit's actually made up of multiple presentations, and all of the slides that we had today and more are included within the toolkit. So you can access that on ifeeder.org. And with that, I think we'll turn it back over. I mean, Sarah, maybe, who has the last slide here?
Yeah, I think Emily's going to help walk us through just a quick poll, and then I think that'll wrap us up.
Yep. Thanks, guys. So real quickly, we just wanted to pull this up and give the opportunity to provide some feedback on the webinar as well as some of the resources that we covered today. I know you guys haven't necessarily had a chance to dive deep into the resources, but I believe this slide will be available in the future distribution of the slides. Laura, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep, we'll put it there.
And so you'll be able to provide feedback in the future too if you want through this survey. So if you don't mind, either I think we can post the link in the chat. Thanks, Sarah. Or you can scan the QR code, and it's only 3 questions. Take a short moment of your time, but that would really help us in determining how to provide resources for you guys in the future.
Great. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us for the webinar. Matt, Sarah, Emily, thanks for your insights, and we look forward to continuing to engage with the industry on efforts on your sustainability journeys. So thanks so much, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks for the opportunity, Laura, and to the funders. We appreciate it. Have a great day.